You must pray to God for forgiveness.
We often think that our modern world has seen the worst, but trust me, today's execution methods and torture have nothing on the gruesome horrors of the ancient world.
Where is the Brotherhood?
I don't know, please.
Where is the Brotherhood?
I don't know.
Number 20. Roman parricides faced poena culae. In Roman law, different forms of murder carried distinct punishments, and the severity of the punishment depended on the nature of the crime. Among these, parricide, the act of killing one's own parent or parents, was considered one of the most heinous crimes. Those convicted of this gruesome act faced the terrifying punishment known as poena culae. The ritual of poena culae was an exceptionally cruel and unusual form of capital punishment. When a person was found guilty of parricide, their fate was sealed. This gruesome execution began with a merciless flogging, which would already be enough to terrify most people. But the worst was yet to come. The condemned individual was then subjected to a series of horrifying steps. First, a wolfskin bag was placed over their head, robbing them of sight and perhaps symbolizing the cruelty of their act. They were then forced to wear wooden-soled clogs, making movement painful and arduous. But here's where it gets truly macabre. The convicted parricide was tied into an ox leather sack along with a disturbing menagerie of animals: a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. These animals weren't there as companions, they were instruments of torment. Now sewn into this grotesque sack, the condemned person was taken to a river or the sea, carried by black oxen, and ultimately thrown into the water to meet their gruesome and thorough drowning. The animals inside the sack would likely contribute to the horror as well. Interestingly, poena culae rarely employed as a form of punishment. Roman biographers have noted that it was primarily those who confessed to parricide who were subject to this terrifying fate. In 118 CE, Emperor Hadrian allowed for poena culae to be substituted with another gruesome punishment, being thrown to wild beasts. Just a century later, this exceptionally cruel method was considered obsolete and thankfully abandoned. So if you think modern justice is harsh, just remember the horrifying history of poena culae, a punishment as bizarre as it was brutal. Number 19. Drawing and quartering. You're about to experience a punishment so brutal and horrifying that it's almost beyond belief. Drawing and quartering was a method of execution that came into gruesome practice in 13th century England and remained in use until 1867, reserved exclusively for those convicted of treason. It all began with drawing, which involved tying the condemned person to a horse and dragging them to the gallows. While hanging was often part of the process, it was by no means the end of their torment. Those sentenced to this horrifying fate might also face disembowelment or beheading. But the true horror lay in the quartering, the second part of this gruesome punishment. The condemned person's body was literally torn apart. Their limbs were tied to different horses, each urged to run in opposite directions. The result was a grotesque and horrifying spectacle. To serve as a macabre warning to others, the four quarters of the person's body were often displayed in different parts of the city. Number 18. Ling Chi. Ling Chi, also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, was a method of torturous execution practiced in ancient China. This punishment was a protracted and agonizing process that spanned centuries, with its use dating back to as early as the 10th century. Fortunately, it was finally banned in 1905. The condemned person was tied to a post and the excruciating process began. The tormentors would methodically remove bits of skin and limbs one by one, inflicting incredible pain with each cut. The ordeal usually culminated in a final cut to the heart or decapitation. Imagine the horror of enduring this slow, drawn-out death sentence. Number 17. Cropping of ears. This brutal penalty involved precisely what the name suggests: the removal of a person's ears as a form of retribution. In less severe cases, a variation of this gruesome practice was applied. Rather than complete ear removal, the ears of the convicted were sometimes nailed to a pillory for an agonizing period. Most chillingly, this punishment often didn't claim the lives of the condemned. Instead, it left them with lasting scars, both physical and psychological. Infections resulting from the wounds could lead to an excruciating death. Number 16. Death by boiling. Our next stop on this harrowing list takes us to an era where people played with not only their food, but with the lives of the condemned. The practice of boiling individuals alive. Today, boiling is a method of cooking. The process was as excruciating as it sounds. The condemned was stripped of their dignity and clothing, then placed in a cauldron or vat filled with boiling liquid, typically water, oil, or even tar. Imagine, if you will, the agony of being slowly cooked alive. In some cases, the offender was lowered into a vessel with initially cool liquid, and then subjected to an agonizing rise in temperature. Shockingly, historical records from the reign of England's King Henry VIII show that some individuals endured up to 2 hours of this torment before finally succumbing to death. The origins of this horrific punishment can be traced back to the cruel reign of Emperor Nero in ancient Rome, where Christians were often the victims. In the 16th century, King Henry VIII of England went so far as to pass an act that deemed poisoning a crime punishable by boiling. Perhaps it was his own fear of poisoning that led to this gruesome decree. Thankfully, in the wake of Henry's death, his son Edward VI recognized the need to put an end to such barbaric practices, signaling the beginning of the end for these horrors. Number 15. Sawed in half. This nightmarish fate was inflicted upon unfortunate souls in various parts of the world, including the Roman Empire, Spain, and regions of Asia. The premise is as gruesome as it sounds. The condemned individual faced a gruesome dismemberment, often in a public spectacle designed to send a horrifying message to onlookers. The brutal method of execution was a literal dissection of a living person. This horrifying practice involved the slow and agonizing removal of a person's internal organs while they were still alive, ultimately leading to their death. Number 14. Crushed under an elephant. This gruesome practice was disturbingly popular in ancient India and several other regions of Southeast Asia. The power and size of elephants made them perfect instruments of death in this gruesome public spectacle. Convicts were placed beneath the massive feet of trained elephants with the intention of delivering a swift and brutal death. However, the level of cruelty could vary. In some cases, the elephants were trained to prolong the agony, inflicting a slow and torturous demise. Imagine the sheer horror of witnessing this gruesome event, as the world's largest land mammal was weaponized to carry out these executions. The sight of a helpless individual being trampled by the elephant's immense weight is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. It's worth noting that this method of execution was most common in areas where elephants were native, primarily in South and Southeast Asia. Human cruelty knows no bounds, even towards majestic creatures like elephants trained for this brutal purpose. Number 13. The Brazen Bull. Hold your breath, because we're about to explore one of the most sadistic and diabolical creations in the annals of human history. The Brazen Bull, also known as the Sicilian Bull. This nightmarish device was conceived by the ancient Greeks, specifically by the tyrant king Phalaris of Sicily in the 6th century BCE. His cruel reputation seems to have known no bounds, and he sought to invent a punishment that would match his sinister desires. The Brazen Bull was a bronze statue constructed in the shape and size of an actual bull. The condemned person would be locked inside this gruesome contraption. A fire would then be set beneath the bull, heating the bronze until the person inside was literally roasted alive. If that alone wasn't horrifying enough, the device included a macabre mechanism that transformed the anguished screams of the victim into eerie bellowing sounds, reminiscent of a raging bull. The sheer sadism behind this invention is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Even King Valeris, who was notorious for his cruelty, was reportedly shocked by the brutality of the Brazen Bull. In a darkly ironic twist, he ultimately subjected the very creator of the bull, a sadistic inventor named Pardes, to his own deadly creation. Pardes was locked inside the bull, and a fire was lit beneath it, exposing him to the gruesome fate he had devised. But the tale takes another sinister turn. After a brief release, King Valeris threw Pardes off a cliff, proving once again how indecisive and ruthless he was. Some accounts even suggest that Valeris himself met a fitting end, burned alive inside the same Brazen Bull he had commissioned as part of an uprising against his reign. Number 12. The horrifying fate of the Vestal Virgins. Our journey through the darkest punishments in history takes us to ancient Rome, where the Vestal Virgins held a sacred role as priestesses to Vesta, the goddess of home and hearth. These women served as not only religious symbols, but also as representatives of the city and its citizens. The dedication required for this role was unparalleled, as they were expected to make a lifetime commitment and uphold strict rules that came with it. One of the most stringent rules was that Vestal Virgins had to remain abstinent from sexual relations for their entire lives. This vow of celibacy was a crucial aspect of their role, symbolizing purity and protection for the city they represented. The Vestals served as guardians of Rome's spiritual well-being, and their chastity played a vital role in this duty. However, the consequences for breaking this sacred oath were dire. If a Vestal Virgin was found to have engaged in sexual activity, her punishment was execution, but not in the traditional sense. Due to the sacred and symbolic nature of the Vestals, taking their lives directly was considered an unholy act. Instead, a more gruesome fate awaited. The condemned Vestal was paraded through the city, her broken purity a symbol of disgrace. Eventually, she reached a small chamber near the Colline Gate. In this chamber, she was left with only a lamp and a small amount of food. Then, the chamber was sealed, and she was buried alive. Number 11. A terrifying punishment for the worst criminals. The boats. It's time for one of history's most grotesque and debated forms of execution, known as scaphism, or more vividly, the boats. This gruesome method was said to have been used by the ancient Persians, but its authenticity remains highly contentious. Scaphism was a punishment reserved for only the most heinous criminals. It was described by Plutarch in his work Parallel Lives, and its execution involved a series of nightmarish steps that defy belief. The victim would first be laid flat within a boat, while another boat, equipped with holes for the head, hands, and feet to protrude, was placed over them. The executioners then compelled the victim to drink a mixture of honey and milk, after which they liberally coated the exposed body parts with the same vicious concoction. With these macabre preparations complete, the victim was left within the boats, and nature was left to take its course. As time passed, the victim had no choice but to excrete where they lay. Flies would soon descend, swarming over the helpless person, and they would be left to their horrifying fate, slowly consumed by these relentless insects. One gruesome account of scaphism involved the execution of Mithridates, a soldier who had killed the brother of Persian king Artaxerxes in the 5th century BCE. Supposedly, Mithridates endured this agony for a staggering 17 days before finally succumbing. The authenticity of scaphism, however, remains in dispute. Mithridates' execution is the only recorded instance, and the primary source documenting it is lost. Even the accounts of ancient historians referencing the work of a Greek physician to the Persian court, Ctesias, who claimed to have witnessed Mithridates' punishment, are subjects of debate. Plutarch's own account was penned 400 years after the event supposedly occurred, and relies heavily on Ctesias' work. Number 10. Crucifixion. Crucifixion, one of the most infamous forms of execution in human history, takes its place on this terrifying list. The harrowing practice of crucifixion first emerged under the Assyrians and Babylonians, and its use rippled through history. The Persians, the empire of Alexander the Great, and the Phoenicians, who introduced it in Rome in the 3rd century BC, all contributed to this gruesome tradition. The act of crucifixion was designed to induce unimaginable agony. The condemned individual was either tied or nailed to a wooden beam, most commonly referred to as a cross. Nails were driven through the bones below the wrists to bear the person's weight. A horrifying benefit of this method was that it avoided major blood vessels, though it did target the median nerve. As a result, the fingers would contract painfully and the hands would seize. The feet were likewise nailed to the vertical part of the cross. As the legs weakened, the arms had to support the body, resulting in the shoulders being dislocated and the elbows and wrists following suit. The arms stretched several inches due to this brutal ordeal. At this stage, the chest bore the weight of the body, leading to respiratory distress and eventually suffocation. One haunting real-life example of crucifixion was the Crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which took place in Judea in the 1st century AD. He was arrested, subjected to a trial, sentenced, flogged, and ultimately crucified by the Romans. Number 9. Rat torture. Dark and gruesome. Rats, creatures known for their gnawing appetite, are turned into the instruments of horror in this method of torture. A rat would be placed inside a small cage, strategically positioned against the victim's abdomen. The cage, a vessel of suffering, would be heated from the outside using a candle, flaming stick, or hot coals, driving the rat into a frenzy. The rat, desperate to escape the intensifying heat, would find only one way out: by clawing and chewing its way through the victim's soft and vulnerable skin. The rat's relentless journey would lead it into the victim's bowels, causing indescribable agony and anguish in the process. This gruesome technique served a sinister purpose, extracting information from prisoners while exploiting the depths of their psychological trauma. This horrifying method was not limited to a particular region or time period. In Europe, during the Dutch Revolt in the 17th century, Dutch leader Diederik Sonoy employed rat torture on prisoners. In South America, between 1964 and 1990, military dictatorships in countries like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay used this method, leaving a horrifying legacy of cruelty. Number 8. The rack, a gruesome stretch of the body. Enter the terrifying world of the rack, one of the most infamous and agonizing torture devices of the ancient world. This instrument of torment was designed to stretch the human body to the limits of its endurance, inflicting excruciating pain that is beyond imagination. The rack typically consisted of a wooden table equipped with axles and levers at both ends. The victim, helpless and bound, would be forced to lie down on this sinister apparatus. Leather straps or belts were tightly fastened around their wrists and heels, ensuring their immobility. Chains or ropes were then connected to these straps, winding over the axles. The torturers, sometimes working together, would gradually push the levers, causing the axles to rotate and intensify tension in the chains. The consequences of this horrific process were physically devastating. Vertebrae were mercilessly stretched, joints dislocated, muscles and tendons torn, posture irreparably altered, the rib cage constricting the lungs, bones shattered, and nerve endings exposed. The agony experienced by the victim defies description. For those who were deemed especially tough, an even more gruesome fate awaited. They were placed on spiked axles which tore away the flesh from their backs. Real-life examples further underscore the harrowing reality of the rack. In 1447, British Constable John Exeter employed this device to torture prisoners in the infamous Tower of London. Centuries earlier, in 356 BC, the Greeks used the rack to torment a Greek arsonist named Herostratus, who had committed the unthinkable crime of burning down the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Number 7. Keel hauling. Watery hell. The term comes from the Dutch word keelhalen, meaning to drag along the keel, which is precisely what this torture method did. The sailor was stripped, tied, and suspended by a rope from the ship's mast, with weights or chains attached to their legs. The rope was looped beneath the ship, and once the sailor was released, they were dragged under the keel. The fatality rate was practically 100%. If the person did not drown, they suffered severe head trauma from repeatedly smacking against the keel, as well as deep lacerations from the barnacles and other aquatic growth present on the hull. If they survived and were hauled back on board, death would still most likely result from their wound infections. Historical records provide chilling evidence of this barbaric practice. The Dutch, between 1560 and 1853, were known to employ keel hauling on their ships. The English Royal Navy also employed this method as early as the 11th century, with 17th century English writers documenting its use on British naval vessels. Going even further back, the 700 BC Rhodian Maritime Code, known as the Lex Rhodia, explicitly outlined keel hauling as a punishment for piracy, showing the ancient Greeks' propensity for brutality. Number 6. The wheel. Gruesome mutilation. We now arrive at the gruesome wheel, also known as the execution wheel, breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel. This sinister instrument of torment was disturbingly common in the ancient world and often reserved for gruesome public executions. Variations exist, but the objective remained the same: not just to kill the victim, but to inflict agonizing mutilation. The ordeal began with the prisoner bound to a large wooden wheel, a nightmarish frame adorned with menacing spoked arms. The executioner's sadistic artistry unfurled as they methodically shattered the victim's leg bones, working their way upwards. An iron bar became an instrument of relentless brutality, mercilessly bludgeoning the hapless soul to the precipice of death, pulverizing bones with ruthless abandon. The grisly spectacle continued as the now grotesquely maimed prisoner was repositioned on the wheel. Their heels were maneuvered to converge at the back of their neck, sealing their fate. There, they were left to bleed to a horrific death. Throughout Europe, this merciless punishment found notoriety in Austria, Britain, France, Francia, Germany, Rome, the Indian subcontinent, Russia, Scotland, and Sweden. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from 1348, where a Jew named Bona endured 4 days and nights of this unspeakable torment, marking the longest recorded survival. In 2019, a haunting archaeological discovery in Milan unveiled a skeleton believed to be a victim of this malevolent device. Number 5. Impalement, a grisly penetration. An extremely gruesome form of torture pervasive in many civilizations throughout the ancient world. The purposeful intent behind impalement ranged from capital punishment to suppressing revolts, disciplining defectors, or quelling military insubordination in times of war. This abhorrent method was executed in 2 dreadful variations: longitudinal and transversal. In the longitudinal method, the victim was positioned above a menacing, grease-slicked stake, which would be inserted partway through their lower body. Gravity became the merciless executioner as the stake gradually ran through them, sparing vital organs while exiting through the skin of their shoulder or neck. A living nightmare, the victim could endure this agony for several harrowing days. In the transversal variant, the stake cruelly pierced through the torso, either from front to back or in the reverse. To intensify the horror, there was a particularly gruesome version known as gaunching, where victims were flung onto jagged metal spikes, hooks, or rods, left to languish in excruciating torment, their agony prolonged by the executioner's sadism. Impalement stained the pages of history with its evil, surfacing in Persia, Europe, Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and Pharaonic Egypt during antiquity. Number 4. Blood Eagle. Unfurling macabre wings. If the horrors described thus far haven't left you thoroughly unnerved, prepare to be chilled to the bone by the gruesome ritual known as the Blood Eagle. Though the authenticity of this torture method remains hotly debated, its mere existence, whether in reality or as a creation of a profoundly disturbed imagination, is deeply unsettling. The blood eagle procedure presents a nightmarish tableau. The victim would be laid prone, subjected to a living nightmare as their back was methodically sliced open. Their torturers would then detach the ribs from the spine, gruesomely unfurling the victim's lungs through the macabre opening, creating a pair of horrific bloody wings. The sheer agony of such an ordeal beggars belief, and one can scarcely fathom how anyone could remain conscious throughout. While no concrete historical evidence attests to the actual practice of the blood eagle, its earliest mention is attributed to Ivar the Boneless, son of Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok in the year 867 AD. He purportedly condemned the king of Northumbria to the blood eagle for killing Ragnar via a pit of live snakes. Number 3. Molten Gold, burning from the inside. This ghastly practice was potentially more prevalent than historical records might suggest, with evidence pointing to its use on both sides of the Atlantic, including by the Romans and the Spanish Inquisition. The process was chillingly straightforward. The victim would be forcibly restrained, their mouth pried open, and scorching liquid gold poured down their throat. The results were nothing short of horrific, inflicting severe damage to internal organs and scalding the lungs, ultimately leading to a swift and agonizing death. In 1599, native Indians of the Javaro tribe captured a Spanish governor and executed him in a gruesome manner by forcing molten gold down his throat. The Roman general and politician Marcus Licinius Crassus suffered this dreadful fate when he was captured by the Parthians. It is believed that this form of execution was chosen to symbolize Crassus' insatiable thirst for wealth. Another Roman general and politician, Manius Aquilius, met a similarly grisly end. Defeated and captured, he too faced execution by means of molten gold. Number 2. Flaying, skinned alive. Flaying, also known as skinning, was arguably one of the most excruciating forms of execution due to its agonizingly gradual nature. The torment began with the victim being stripped of their clothing, their hands and feet securely bound to prevent any movement. The executioner would then commence with the gruesome task of peeling away the individual skin using a sharp blade. This ordeal often initiated with the head, ensuring maximum suffering as the victim remained fully conscious. In some instances, parts of the person's body were boiled to soften the skin and facilitate its removal. Death could come in various harrowing ways: shock, profuse blood or fluid loss, hypothermia, or deadly infection. The duration between the initiation of flaying and death could vary from a few hours to several excruciating days. While flaying is often depicted as a medieval European form of punishment in popular culture, such as in Game of Thrones, historical accounts reveal that it was rarely employed in medieval Europe. According to medieval historian Dr. Larissa Tracy, only one verifiable case of flaying occurred between the 11th and 16th centuries. However, flaying was far more prevalent in the ancient world. It was practiced by civilizations including the Assyrians, Aztecs, Chinese, and various medieval European peoples. Notable accounts of flaying include the alleged case of the female philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria, who was flayed by a Christian mob using potsherds. One of the most infamous practitioners of flaying was the Assyrian Empire, where it was employed extensively from the 14th century BCE until 610 BCE. The Assyrians, renowned for their military prowess, adopted flaying as a form of punishment for those who opposed their rule. This included flaying the nobility and using their skins to instill fear and suppress any potential resistance. King Ashur-bani-pal, an Assyrian monarch, documented this brutality, stating, quote, "I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me, and draped their skins over the pile of corpses. Some I spread out within the pile, some I erected on stakes upon the pile. I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins over the walls." The terrifying practice of flaying served not only as a means of punishing adversaries, but also as a gruesome method of deterrence, discouraging others from challenging the Assyrian Empire's authority. Number 1. The Roman Candle, the ultimate torture method of the ancient world. Taking the top spot as the most gruesome and macabre method of execution in the ancient world is the ghastly Roman candle. This terrifying execution style is not only a testament to the cruelty of the era, but also the malevolence of those in power, with Emperor Nero standing out as a particularly sadistic figure. Nero's intense hatred for Christians led to the creation of this nightmarish execution method. The victims, who were often accused of various crimes, were subjected to unimaginable torment during Nero's garden parties. The process began with the victims being tightly bound and nailed to tall wooden stakes. Once they were immobilized, flammable liquid was poured over their helpless bodies. The fire was ignited at their feet, an intentionally prolonged method designed to maximize their suffering. The victims were condemned to a fate where they were literally turned into human torches. This brutal act reveals not only the savagery of ancient punishments, but also the profound cruelty of those in power, who considered certain segments of the population as disposable and unworthy of compassion. The painting, Nero's Torches, captures a heart-wrenching scene in which Christian martyrs, falsely accused of being responsible for the Great Fire of Rome, are on the brink of being consumed by the merciless flames. These gruesome candles stand as a grim symbol of the earliest persecutions against Christians under Roman rule. Well, that's the end of our shocking investigation of ancient punishments. If you were as horrified and fascinated as we were, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell. Stay tuned for more amazing historical content, and thank you for watching.